Hello, my name is Amanda Lintz, and this is my media clip final project for TESP 302. So over the past 8 weeks, we've gained a wealth of knowledge over the 13 disabilities and exceptionalities covered under IDEA. Due to a time constraint, I'm going to limit myself to just speaking on four of the most important topics. And I've chose to admit ADHD since we've already done a presentation on that. But I also think that that is a very important disability to keep in mind in our careers. So first off, let's discuss speech and language impairments. On page 125, the text states that 21.4% of all students suffer from a speech language disorder. And I actually found this statistic really surprising. I thought it was a very high, but when we do look at speech or language impairments, it really focuses on a lot of different variety of disabilities. So a communication disorder can be a speech impairment, a language impairment, or both. Let's focus on speech first. A speech impairment is the difficulty making sounds or having issues with their voice quality. And one of the disorders that is important to note is apraxia of speech. And it's one of these disorders where students cannot properly combine the production of sounds to create full words or sentences. And it's not to say that they don't know how to speak, and it's not to say that they don't have the words inside their brain. It's just they are having trouble putting the syllables together to create the words in the sentences. Um, the text defines a language disorder as the difficulty receiving, understanding, or formulating ideas and information. So students with this speech or language disorder might fall behind in other academic areas due to poor oral abilities, and that is especially true when it comes to reading fluency, which is really important early on in their education career because it's really such a big building block for the rest of their education. They might also suffer socially, as they could be embarrassed or even frustrated with their communication difficulties. I think it's important to talk to the students' parents and also the student themselves and kind of get a feel for how they feel about their speech or language impairments because you don't want to take a student who stutters, for example, and call on him in the middle of class and have all eyes on him and him feel really embarrassed or out of place, and that kind of make him want to pull into himself even more. So I think we really have to get a really good feel on who our students are and how they have taken to their disability so we can adapt our lesson plans to them. We also need to watch for withdrawal from peers. It could help to focus on one-on-one peer interaction when it comes to students with speech or language impairments, and then kind of upgrade to small group interactions as they feel more comfortable interacting with their peers and speaking. It's also important, I think, for teachers to try to work closely with speech therapists if they are in school, and that's a possibility, and the guardians. If possible, we can supply extra work on repetition and sound patterns if appropriate. Excuse me. Next, I'd like to focus on autism spectrum disorder. And this is a disorder that can be accompanied with a large range of difficulties. It truly affects all children differently. So one child can have very minor issues while another child's would be much major and would need much more attention when moving forward for their learning. Some symptoms of autism spectrum disorder are repetitive movements, resistance to change, and sensory stimulation issues. And these all can affect their learning and development. It's also important to note that a lot of students who suffer from autism struggle socially, but they're actually incredibly intelligent. And that's not to say that they don't struggle academically, because the issues that they do face can make it pretty hard for them to pay attention and succeed in the classroom. let's look at the repetitive movements first off. They can really make it difficult for students to concentrate in the learning environment, not only the student with autism, but also students around them. Um, and it can also make assignments and test taking very difficult. So, as teachers, some ways around that is maybe allowing oral tests, longer testing times, or providing a different environment that's not distracting for the student with autism, and then allows them to try to focus more, so that all of their attention can be on their test alone. Um, it's also really important to note that the school day is really busy for children. They jump from class to class or subject to subject, and it can be difficult for students with autism to be able to feel settled and relaxed in their environments. So, as elementary teachers, I think it might be a good idea if we were to split up our day for students with autism, so our um, schedule as a whole for the entire class. We could do, math in the morning prior to their music class, or then, reading after snack time, or whatever the schedule allows us to do, just to have a set schedule set in place and kind of ease our students with autism into that schedule when we first start out the school year. That way we can make sure that we can try to be as repetitive and scheduled as possible for them. I also think that advanced organizers will also be a great tool for students with autism. We can do so, use these as for a class as a whole. We could write on the board what our expectations are for the day or for the week. Kind of depends on the grade level of the students and how they kind of take to such a thing. Or we could even create just simple handouts that they can have on their desk. There's really just a variety of options we have available, but I think that that's something that's a really great tool for students with autism to have, so they know what to expect next and they know what they need to be prepared for. Also, as teachers, I think it's important that we know our students with autism's individual triggers, and we know calm down techniques that work for them, because we have to understand that not every child is the same. So we really need to make sure that we have connected with their caregivers and with the student themselves, so we can really dig deep and know what that student needs from us as a teacher. I think that the idea of a calm down corner in the classroom, not only for students with autism, but for students who suffer from many different disabilities, or even just students having a tough day, is a really great idea. We could have headphones set aside for students who have a sensory overload and really need to kind of relax and center themselves. Um, we could have different textures available to kind of touch and kind of relax ourselves with, also really good for sensory seeking students. So discussing sensory issues is a great segue into the next section, emotional and behavior disorders. So I really want to hit on sensory processing disorder, which is something that's often accompanied by the autism, but it's also a standalone disorder, and it kind of rides the lines into an emotional and behavior disorder. Um, Interestingly enough, not all schools kind of acknowledge sensory processing disorder as something that needs to have a 504 plan or even an IEP or anything like that. And there are also a lot of therapists out there who are kind of shying away nowadays from diagnosing SPD and even giving it a name per se. Um, but I would still like to discuss it because I think it's a really um, big big disorder that we need to discuss when it comes to emotional and behavioral disorders. So SPD is basically just little bodies with big emotions. These students get easily overwhelmed. They're unable to express their feelings verbally all the time, and so this kind of manifests into tantrums and aggression that they show outwardly. It can be even the smallest of things that really triggers sensory processing disorder, as well as other emotional and behavioral disorders. Simply getting dressed, loud environments, new people, having their schedules kind of change and not being prepared for the next thing that's to come for them, getting dirty or having to touch something that the texture doesn't quite agree with them, or just having high anxiety in many situations. I think when it comes to emotional and behavioral disorders, I think it's the one that teachers and adults as a whole can easily get overwhelmed and frustrated by. Um, because these students do tend to present themselves in an aggressive manner and by throwing tantrums, and it's really hard to reason with the student who's throwing a tantrum as they're in a fight or flight mode in their brain, and they're not able to comprehend what you're saying to them, and they're not able to take in any information. And as a teacher, that's incredibly difficult. You can't teach the entire classroom, and you can't teach that student when we are in a situation like that. So I think it's really important, first and foremost, to make sure that when we're including these children in an inclusion environment, that we are making sure that the student is safe, we as teachers are safe, and that the other students around are also safe. I think it's also very important that student or teachers have conflict resolution techniques ready and available. And that's not necessarily something we need to have right away when we start our career, but as we have students with these different abilities and disabilities, we need to do our research, maybe talk to therapists or the guardians or anyone that we possibly can to get more insight into these students and to get more techniques to help them out. I think it's really important that if the student has a occupational therapist, to reach out to them and try to get tips from them as well. With emotional and behavioral disorders, you're looking at high anxiety during test taking time, which can make academics really difficult. A student can pay attention all they want in the class, they can do their homework, they can understand, but when it comes test taking time, they are unable to focus because they are so overwhelmed by the idea of not doing well. They can run out of time, they can just have difficulty getting through the assignment. So we can allow extra time to do the assignment. We can allow them to do it in a different environment, maybe not around a class full of students. Socially, we see that they have trouble interacting with their peers or even playing freely as they do. When students have high amounts of anxiety, they are unable to kind of do very simple things that the other kids might do, like jump off high monkey bars or things like that. Those things can give them anxiety, and they can outwardly express themselves with aggression and anger. So we do see issues with that. And at the same time, other students don't quite understand emotional and behavioral disorders. And so I think that that can sometimes pull them away from these students as well. An interesting statistic I found in the text on page 153 was that 22% of students with emotional and behavioral disorders are held back a grade, and ultimately 52% drop out of school. And I thought that was alarmingly high, and definitely a statistic that we as teachers need to look at and discuss and try to kind of figure out a way that we can do better by these students. The last thing I want to talk about today, and see if I can get this in 2 minutes, is hearing and visual impairments. On page 310, it states that 57% of students with hearing impairments spend 80% of their day in the classroom. And I found this surprising because I actually feel like hearing and visual impairments are the hardest to create and to have an inclusive classroom for, because it is difficult to kind of create differentiated instruction for them in our standard classroom with peers. But obviously it's important to note that these impairments really vary in their degree of severity from student to student. So obviously that's why that statistic is a little bit higher. When taking one's ability to hear or see, you're really drastically reducing their ability to learn from their environment, which is something that is incredibly difficult for young learners. So we can try to give our visually impaired students an opportunity to learn and explore as much as possible and kind of create a tidy and predictable environment for them to be able to do so. For our hearing impaired students, it's helpful to create a supportive classroom by still giving these students ways to interact with their peers by sign language, gestures, computer programs, etc. We really want to try to create as much of an inclusive environment as we can. And I know young learners really enjoy being able to interact with others and learn sign language and things like that. Everyone wants to be friends with everyone in the young grade age groups. All right, that's all I can fit in. Thank you very much.